Hello, welcome to this ASMR audio. Today I'm going to be reading the second part of the first chapter of Since You've Been Gone by Matson. This is going to be soft spoken, not whispered. So if you're not really into soft spoken ASMR, then I'm sure one of my other videos would suit you a little better. So previously in the book, Emily, our main character, has figured out that Sloane is really gone and her parents are writing a new screenplay. Oh good, my mother said. We were just going to call you two. We need to have a family meeting. Wait, I said quickly, taking a step forward. Mom, I needed to talk to you and Dad. It's about Sloane. Family meeting, my dad boomed from inside the kitchen. His voice was deep, very loud, and it was the reason he was always getting assigned to the 8 a.m. classes. He was one of the few professors in the English department who could keep the freshmen awake. Beckett, Emily, he stepped out of the kitchen and blinked when he saw us. Oh, that was fast. Dad, I said, hoping I could somehow get in front of this. I needed to talk to you guys. We need to talk to you too, my mother said. Your father and I were chatting last night and we somehow got on. Scott, how did we start talking about this? It was because your reading light burned out, my dad said, taking a step closer to my mom. We started talking about the electricity. Right, my mother said, nodding. Exactly. So we started talking about Edison, then Tesla, and then Edison and Tesla, and we think we might have a play. My dad finished, glancing into the dining room. I saw they already had their laptops set up across the table facing each other. We were going to bounce around some ideas. It might be nothing. I nodded, but I knew with a sinking feeling that it wasn't nothing. My parents had done this enough that they knew when something was worth making a bulk supermarket run. I knew the signs well. They always downplayed ideas they truly saw promise in. But when they started talking excitedly about a new play, already seeing its potential before anything was written, I knew it would fizzle out in a few days. So we might be working a bit, my mother said, in what was sure to be the understatement of the summer. We bought supplies, she said, gesturing vaguely to the kitchen where I could see the jumbo-sized bags of frozen peas and microwave burritos were starting to melt. And there's always emergency money in the conch. The conch shell had served as a prop during the Broadway production of Bug Juice, my parents' most successful play, and now, in addition to being where we kept household cash, served as a bookend for a listing pile of cookbooks. Beckett's going to be at day camp during the week, so he's all set. Annabelle's going too, my mother said, maybe noticing Beckett's scowl. What about camping? He asked. We'll still go camping, my dad said. Maybe seeing his alarmed look, he added, just your brother and me, the Hughes men in the wilderness. But Beckett looked into the dining room, his brow furrowed. My dad waved this away. We aren't going until July, he said, and I'm sure this idea won't amount to much anyway. What about you, Em? My mom asked, even as she drifted closer to the dining room like she was being pulled there by gravitational force. Do you have any summer plans worked out? I bit my lip. Sloane and I had made plans upon plans for the summer. We had concert tickets purchased. She had told me she had mapped out something called a pizza crawl, and I had decided we should spend the summer seeking out Stanwich's best cupcake. Sloane had a plan for both of us to find summer boys, but she had been vague on how we were going to accomplish this. We'd block off the weekends, we would drive upstate to the various flea markets she'd spent the last few months scouting, and I'd already gone through the drive-in calendar and decided which nights we needed to block off for the double features. She'd planned on making friends with someone who had a pool, and had decided this would be the summer she'd finally beat me at mini golf. I was weirdly naturally skilled at it, and I discovered that Sloane got strangely competitive when there was stuffed animals prizes involved. I wanted to learn the zombie dance from Thriller, and she wanted to learn the dance from London Moore's new video, that one that had sparked all sorts of protests from parents' groups. At some point, we were going to need to get jobs, of course, but we decided it was going to be something unchallenging that we could do together, like we had the summer before. And when we'd waitressed at the Stanwich Country Club, Sloane earning more tips than anyone else, me getting a reputation for being an absolute whiz at filling the ketchup bottles at the end of the night. We'd also left lots of time unscheduled, the long stretches of hours we'd spent at the beach or walking around or just hanging out with no plan beyond maybe getting fountain Diet Cokes. It was Sloane. You usually didn't need more than that to have the best Wednesday of your life. I swallowed hard as I thought about all these plans, the whole direction I'd planned for my summer to go, just vanishing. And I realized that if Sloane were here, suddenly having my parents otherwise occupied and not paying attention to things like my curfew would have meant we could have had the most epic summer ever. I could practically see that summer, the one I wanted, the one I should have been living, shimmering in front of me like a mirage before it faded and disappeared. "Emily?" my mother prompted, and I looked back at her. She was in the same room with me. She was technically looking at me, but I knew when my parents were present and when their minds were on their play. For just a moment, I thought about trying to tell them about Sloane, trying to get them to help me figure out what had happened. But I knew that they'd say yes with the best intentions and then forget all about it as they focused on Tesla and Edison. "I'm working on it," I finally said. "Sounds good," my dad said, nodding. My mom smiled like I'd given her the answer she wanted, even though I hadn't told them anything concrete. But it was clear they wanted this off their plates so they could consider their children more or less sorted and then could get to work. They were both edging toward the dining room where their laptops glowed softly, beckoning. I sighed and started to head to the kitchen, figuring that I should get the frozen stuff into the freezer before it went bad. "Oh, my mother said, sticking her head out of the dining room. I saw my father was already sitting in his chair, opening up his laptop and stretching out his fingers. "A letter came for you." My heart slowed and then started beating double time. There was only one person who regularly wrote to me, and they weren't even actually letters. They were lists. "Where?" "Microwave," my mother said. She went back into the dining room and I bolted into the kitchen, no longer caring if all the burritos melted. I pushed aside the 12-pack of Kleenex and saw it. It was leaning up against the microwave like it was nothing, next to a bill from the tree guy. But it was addressed to me, and it was in Sloane's handwriting. June, 1 year earlier. "You sent me a list?" I asked. Sloane looked over at me sharply, almost dropping the sunglasses, oversized green frames, that she'd just picked up. I held out the paper in my hands, the letter I'd seen propped up by the microwave as I headed down that morning on my way to pick her up and drive us to the latest flea market she'd found, an hour and change outside of Stanwich. Though there hadn't been a return address, just a heart, I'd recognized Sloane handwriting immediately, a distinctive mix of block letters and cursive. "It's what happens when you go to 3 different schools for 3rd grade, she'd explained to me once. "Everyone is learning this at different stages, and you never get the fundamentals." Sloane and her parents lived the kind of peripatetic existence? I don't even know. Picking up and moving when they felt like it, or when they just wanted a new adventure, that I'd seen in movies, but hadn't known actually existed in real life. I'd learned by now that Sloane used this excuse when it suited her, not just for handwriting, but also for her inability to comprehend algebra, climb a rope in PE, or drive. She was the only person our age I knew who didn't have a license. She claimed that in all of her moves, she'd never quite been the right age for a permit where they were. But I also had a feeling that Millie and Anderson had been occupied with more exciting things than bringing her to driver's ed and then quizzing her every night over dinner, geeking out on traffic regulations and the point system like my dad had done. Whenever I brought up the fact that she lived in Stanwich now and could get a Connecticut license without a problem, Sloane waved it away. "I know the fundamentals of driving," she'd say. If I'm ever on the bus that gets hijacked on the freeway, I can take over when the driver gets shot. No problem. And since Sloane liked to walk whenever possible, a habit she'd picked up living in cities for much of her life, and not just places like Manhattan and Boston, but London and Paris and Copenhagen, she didn't seem to mind that much. I liked to drive and was happy to drive us somewhere. Sloane sitting shotgun, the DJ and navigator, always on top of telling me when our snacks were running low. An older woman, determined to check out the selection of tarnished cufflinks, jostled me out of the way, and I stepped aside. This flea market was similar to many that I'd been to, always with Sloane. We were technically here looking for boots for her, but as soon as we'd paid our $2 apiece and entered the middle school parking lot that had been converted for the weekend into a land of potential treasure, she had made a beeline to this stall, which seemed to be mostly sunglasses and jewelry. Since I'd picked up the letter, I'd been waiting for the right moment to ask her, when I'd have her full attention. And the drive had been the wrong time. There was music to sing along to, and things to discuss, and directions to follow. Sloane smiled at me, even as she put on the terrible green sunglasses hiding her eyes, and I wondered for a moment if she was embarrassed, which I'd almost never seen. "You weren't supposed to get that until tomorrow," she said as she bent down to look at her reflection in the tiny standing mirror. "I was hoping it would be there right before you guys left for the airport. The mail here is too efficient." "But what is it?" I asked, flipping through the pages Emily Goes to Scotland was written across the top. 1. Try haggis. 2. Call at least 3 people lassie. 3. Say at least once, "You can take my life, but you'll never take my freedom." Say this out loud and in public. The list continued on over the next page, filled with things like fly fishing and asking people if they knew where I could find J.K. Rowling, that I did not intend to do, and not just because I would only be gone 5 days. One of my parents' plays was going into rehearsals for the Edinburgh Fringe Fest, and they had decided it would be the perfect opportunity to take a family trip. I suddenly noticed that at the very bottom of the list, in tiny letters, she'd written, "When you finish this list, find me and tell me about it." I looked up at Sloane, who had set the green pair down and was now turning over a pair of rounded cat-eye frames. "It's stuff for you to do in Scotland," she said. She frowned at the sunglasses and held up the frames to me, and I knew she was asking my opinion. I shook my head, and she nodded and set them down. "I wanted to make sure you got the most out of your experience." "Well, I'm not sure how many of these I'll actually do," I said, as I carefully folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. "But this is awesome of you. Thanks so much." She gave me a tiny wink, then continued to look through the sunglasses, clearly searching for something specific. She had spent most of the spring channeling Audrey Hepburn, lots of winged black eyeliner and stripes, skinny black pants and flats, but was currently transitioning into what she was calling 70s California, and referencing people like Marianne Faithfull and Anita Pallenberg, who I'd never heard of, and Penny Lane in Almost Famous, who I had. Today, she was wearing a flower vintage maxi dress and sandals that tied around her ankles, her wavy, dark blonde hair spilling over her shoulders and down her back. Before I'd met Sloane, I didn't know that it was possible to dress the way she did, that anyone not heading to a photo shoot dressed with that much style. My own wardrobe had improved immeasurably since we became friends. Mostly, she picked stuff she'd picked for me, but some things I'd found myself and felt brave enough to wear when I was with her, knowing that she would appreciate it. She'd picked up a pair of gold-rimmed aviators, only slightly bent, and slipped them on, turning to me for my opinion. I nodded, and then noticed a guy who looked a few years younger than us staring at Sloane. He was absently holding a macrame necklace, and I was pretty sure that he had no idea that he'd picked it up, and would have been mortified to realize it. But that was my best friend, the kind of girl your eyes went to in a crowd. While she was beautiful, wavy hair, bright blue eyes, perfect skin dotted with freckles, this didn't fully explain it. It was like she knew a secret, a good one, and if you got close enough, maybe she'd tell you too. "Yes," I said definitively, looking away from the guy and his necklace. "They're great." She grinned. "I think so too. Hate them for me?" "Sure," I said easily as I walked a few steps away from her, making my way up towards the register, pretending to be interested in a truly hideous pair of earrings that seemed to be made out of some kind of tinsel. In my peripheral vision, I saw Sloane pick up another pair of sunglasses, black ones, and look at them for a moment before also taking them to the register, where the middle-aged guy behind it was reading a comic book. "How much for the aviators?" Sloane asked as I edged closer, looking up as if I'd just noticed what she'd picked up. $25, the guy said, not even looking up from his comic. "Ugh," I said, shaking my head. "So not worth it. Look, they're all dented." Sloane gave me a tiny smile before putting her game face back on. I knew she'd been surprised when we'd first started this bargaining technique that I'd been able to roll with it. But when you grew up in the theater, you learned how to handle impromptu improv. "Oh, you're right," she said, looking at them closely. "They're not dented," the guy said, putting his comic Super Friends down. "Those are vintage." I shrugged. "I wouldn't pay more than $15 for them," I said, and saw, a moment too late, Sloane widen her eyes at me. "I mean 10, I said quickly. "Not more than 10. "Yeah," she said, setting them down in front of the guy, along with the square-framed black ones I had seen her pick up. "Also, we just got here. We should look around." "Yes, we should," I said, trying to make it look like I was heading toward the exit without actually leaving. "Wait," the guy said quickly. "I can let you have them for 15. Final offer." "Both of these for 20, Sloane said, looking him right in the eye. 21, the guy bargained lamely, but Sloane just smiled and dug in her pocket for her cash. A minute later, we were heading out of the stall, Sloane wearing her new aviators. "Nicely done," she said. "Sorry for going too high," I said as I stepped around a guy carrying an enormous kitten portrait. "I should have started at 10. She shrugged. "If you start too low, you sometimes lose the whole thing," she said. "Here." She handed me the black sunglasses, and I saw now that they were vintage Ray-Bans. "For you." "Really?" I slipped them on, and with no mirror around, turned to Sloane for her opinion. She took a step back, hands on hips, her face serious, like she was studying me critically, then broke into a smile. "You look great," she said, digging in her bag. She emerged with one of her ever-present disposable cameras and snapped a picture of me before I could hold my hand up in front of my face or stop her. Despite having a smartphone, Sloane always carried a disposable camera with her. Sometimes two. She had panoramic ones, black and white ones, waterproof ones. Last week, we'd taken our first beach swim of the summer, and Sloane had snapped pictures of us underwater, emerging triumphant and holding the camera over her head. "Can your phone do this?" she asked, dragging the camera over the surface of the water. "Can it?" "They look okay?" I asked, though of course I believed her. She nodded. "They're very you." She dropped her camera back in her bag and started wandering through the stalls. I followed as she led us into a vintage clothing stall and headed back to look at the boots. I ducked to see my reflection in the mirror, then checked to make sure her letter was secure in my bag. "Hey," I said, coming to join her from the back, where she was sitting on the ground, already surrounded by options, untying her sandals. I held up the list. "Why did you mail this to me? Why not give it to me in person?" I looked down at the envelope in my hands, at the stamp and postmark and all the work that had gone into it. And why mail anything at all? Why not just tell me? Sloane looked up at me and smiled, a flash of her bright, slightly crooked teeth. "But where's the fun in that?" So the next thing that I'm going to read is the list that she gets sent in present day. That was a flashback, and this is her new list that she just got after Sloane went missing. Number 1, kiss a stranger. Number 2, go skinny dipping. Number 3, steal something. Number 4, break something. Number 5, Penelope. Number 6, ride a darn horse, you cowpoke. Number 7, 55 South Avenue, ask for Mona. Number 8, the backless dress and somewhere to wear it. Number 9, dance until dawn. Number 10, share some secrets in the dark. Number 11, hug a Jamie. Number 12, apple picking at night. Number 13, sleep under the stars. I sat on my bed, gripping this new list in my hands so tightly, I could see the tips of my fingers turning white. I wasn't sure what it meant, but it was something. It was from Sloan. Sloan had sent me a list. As soon as I'd taken it out of the envelope, I just stared at it, my brain not yet turning the symbols into words, into things I could parse. In that moment, it had been enough to know that she had sent me something, that she wasn't just going to disappear and leave me with nothing but questions and memories. There was more to it than that, and it made me feel like the fog I'd been walking around in for the past 2 weeks had cleared to let in some sunlight. Like the others she'd sent, one appearing every time I went away, even if it was just for a few days, there was no explanation. Like the others, it was a list of outlandish things, all outside of my comfort zone, all things I would never normally do. The lists had become something of a running joke with us, and before every trip, I'd wondered what she was going to come up with. The last one, when I had gone to New Haven with my mom for a long weekend, had included things like stealing the bulldog mascot named Handsome Dan, and making out with a whiff-and-poof. I later found out Anderson had gone to Yale, so she'd been able to include lots of specifics. Over the years, I'd managed to check off the occasional item on a trip, and also always told her about it. But she'd always wanted to know why I hadn't done more, why I hadn't checked off every single one. I looked down at the list again and saw that something about this one was different. There were some truly scary things here, like skinny dipping and having to deal with my lifelong fear of horses, the very thought of which was making my palms sweat. But some of them didn't seem so bad. A few of them were almost doable. And as I read the list over again, I realized these weren't the random items that had accompanied my travels to California and Austin and Edinburgh. While many of them still didn't make sense to me, why did she want me to hug someone named Jamie? I recognized the reasoning behind some of them. They were things I'd backed away from, usually because I was scared. It was like she was giving me the opportunity to do some things over again, and differently this time. This made the list seem less like a tossed-off series of items, and more like a test, or a challenge. I turned the paper over, but there was nothing on the other side of it. I picked up the envelope, noted her usual drawing, where most people just wrote their address. This time she'd drawn a palm tree and a backward moon, and that the postmark was too smudged for me to make out a zip code in it. I looked down at the list again, and at Sloane's careful, unmistakable handwriting, and thought about what was sometimes at the bottom of these. When you finish the list, find me and tell me all about it. I could feel my heart beating hard as I realized that this list, that doing these terrifying things, might be the way I would find her again. I wasn't sure how, exactly, that was going to happen, but for the first time since I'd called her number and just gotten a voicemail, it was like I knew what to do with myself. Sloane had left me a map, and maybe, hopefully, it would lead me to her. I read through the items over and over again, trying to find one that wasn't the most terrifying thing I'd ever done, something that I could do right now, today, because I wanted to begin immediately. This list was going to somehow bring me back to Sloane, and I needed to get started. S Avenue in number 7 had to mean Stanwich Avenue, the main commercial street in town. I could show up there and ask for Mona. I could do that. I had no idea what 55 Stanwich Avenue was, but it was the easiest thing on the list, by far. Feeling like I had a plan, some direction, for the first time in 2 weeks, I pushed myself off my bed and headed for the door. Emily? Oh my God! I yelled this as I jumped involuntarily. My brother was in my doorway, but not just leaning against the door frame like a normal person. He was at the very top of the frame, his legs pressed against one side of it, his back against the other. It was his newest thing, after he'd seen it done in some ninja movie. He terrified us all at first, and now I just habitually looked up before entering a room. To say Beckett had no fear of heights was an understatement. He'd figured out how to scale a roof of our house when he was 5, and if we were trying to find him, we all started by looking up. "Sorry," Beckett said, not sounding sorry, shrugging down at me. "How long have you been there?" I asked, realizing that while I had been absorbed in my letter, my brother had come into my room, climbed to the top of my doorframe, all without me noticing. He shrugged again. "I thought you saw me," he said. "Can you drive me somewhere?" "I'm about to go out," I said. I glanced back at Sloane's list and then realized I just left it sitting out on my bed. Our cat was only in the house about half the time, but he seemed to have a preternatural ability to know what was important, and he always destroyed those things first. I picked up the letter and placed it carefully back into the envelope, then tucked it into my top dresser drawer, where I kept my most important things. Childhood mementos, pictures, notes Sloane had slipped into my hand between classes or through the slats of my locker. "Where?" Beckett asked, still from above me. "Stanwich Avenue," I said. I craned my neck back to see him, and suddenly wondered if that was why he did this, so that we'd all have to look up at him for a change instead of the other way around. "Can you take me to Indoor Extreme?" he asked, his voice getting higher, the way it did when he was excited about something. "Annabelle told me about it. It's awesome. Bikes and ropes, courses and paintball." I was about to tell my brother sorry that I was busy, but there was something in his expression that stopped me, and I knew that if I went without him, I'd spend the whole time feeling guilty. "Are you going to want to spend a lot of time there?" I asked. "If I drop you off at this extreme place, because I have somewhere I need to go." Beckett grinned. "Hours," he said, "like all afternoon." I nodded, and Beckett lifted his foot and basically did a free fall down the doorframe, stopping himself before he hit the ground and jumping to his feet. "Meet you at the car." He raced out of my room, and I glanced back to my dresser. I caught my reflection in the mirror above it, and I ran a brush through my hair quickly, hoping that Mona, whoever she was, wouldn't be someone that I needed to impress. I was wearing a vintage t-shirt Sloane had insisted I buy and a pair of jean cutoffs. I was tall. I had a good 4 inches on Sloane unless she was in one of her heel phases. And the only real interesting thing about me were my eyes, which were 2 different colors. One was brown and one was brown and blue. And Sloane had freaked out the first time she'd noticed it, trying out all sorts of different eyeshadow combinations, trying to see if she could get them to turn the same color. My hair was brown, pinned straight, and long, hitting halfway down my back. But any time I'd talked about cutting it, Sloane had protested. "You have such princess hair," she'd said. "Anyone can have short hair." I tucked my hair behind my ears, then pulled open my top drawer to make sure the list and envelope were still safe. When I was sure they were, I headed downstairs, turning over and over in my head what I was about to do. 55 S Avenue. Ask for Mona. And that's the end of chapter 1, of Since You've Been Gone by Morgan Matson. I hope you enjoyed, and stay tuned for chapter 2.